This is a made-up story meant to be fun. Let us know where you are watching from in the comments before we start. It's always interesting to see how far these stories can go. The first Congregational Church in Brattleboro, Vermont, was where the wedding was supposed to take place at 3 o'clock on a Saturday afternoon in late September 1909. The Vermont Historical Society has a church registry that says the wedding between 24-year-old Miriam Ashworth and 37-year-old Cornelius Whitlock was to be a small event for the time, with about 40 people expected to come. The leaves in the fall were at their best, painting the hills around the Connecticut River Valley in bright reds and golds. It should have been, by all accounts, a normal marriage between two upstanding members of the community. 7 people were dead by sunset that same day, and 12 more were very sick at home, with violent symptoms that local doctors had a hard time explaining. The bride herself. She vanished completely between 4:30 and 5 that afternoon, so much so that some witnesses later said they never saw her leave the church. What was left was a reception table covered in half-eaten wedding cake, empty teacups that still had traces of what would later be identified as a strong alkaloid compound, and a community that would spend decades trying to figure out what had happened in those few terrible hours. The official investigation, if you can call it that, only lasted a little less than 3 weeks before, being quietly put away by the county government. There was never an arrest. There was never a body found. Researchers were finally able to look at the case file in 1967. It was only about 30 pages of handwritten notes, witness statements that didn't always agree with each other, and a toxicology report that raised more questions than it answered. To comprehend the events of that September afternoon, it is necessary to revisit the circumstances that initially led Miriam Ashworth to Brattleboro several years prior. She came to town in the spring of 1907. Mrs. Gwendolyn Pritchard kept records of the boarding house she ran on Elliott Street, which was a respectable place that mostly housed unmarried women with limited means. Miriam said she was a widow from Albany, New York, but later investigations found no death certificate for any husband. She said she had training as a seamstress and quickly got a job at the Este Organ Company, where she worked in the finishing department, putting decorative touches on the company's famous musical instruments. People who lived at the time said that Miriam was striking rather than beautiful in the usual way. She was taller than most women her age, maybe 5 feet 8 inches. She had dark hair that she wore pulled back tightly from her face, which one coworker said had a sharpness that made you think twice before speaking carelessly around her. Her eyes were a strange pale gray, according to several witnesses. That seemed to reflect light rather than absorb it. She dressed modestly but with careful attention to detail, always appearing neat and proper despite her limited income. What drew the most comment, however, was her voice. Several people who knew her remarked on this quality independently. It was described variously as low and smooth, like honey poured slowly. The kind of voice that made you lean closer without meaning to, and pleasant but somehow unsettling, as if the words meant more than what was. A local historian who interviewed a former Este factory worker in 1953 to learn more about industrial life in early 20th century Vermont said, "When Miriam spoke, people stopped what they were doing to listen. Not because she said anything very interesting, but because the way she spoke made people pay attention. It seemed to have a big effect on the men. Cornelius Whitlock was one of those men. In the late summer of 1907, he met Miriam for the first time when he went to the Este factory for business related to his job as a distributor of farming tools. The Whitlock family had lived in Windham County for 4 generations. They ran a small but successful business that sold farm equipment to towns in southern Vermont and northern Massachusetts. 3 years before, Cornelius had taken over the business from his father. He ran it with methodical efficiency, but not much creativity or drive. People in the area thought Cornelius was a confirmed bachelor at 35. Rules. He was 14 when his mother died, and he spent most of his adult life taking care of his father as he slowly got worse from consumption. Cornelius lived alone in the family's big Victorian house on Western Avenue after his father died in 1904. The house had a wraparound porch and a carriage house that he turned into a place to store farm equipment. People who lived nearby said he was dependable, quiet, and a little shy, the kind of man who went to church every week, paid his bills on time and didn't, took part in the community's social life more than what was polite. His courting of Miriam Ashworth started out like any other. He went to her boarding house several times that fall, always in the early evening, which he thought was the right time for such visits. Mrs. Pritchard, the boarding housekeeper, kept a personal diary in which she wrote down these visits. She gave the diary to the Historical Society in 1949. Her entries show that she was becoming more and more uneasy about the relationship, but she had trouble putting her feelings into words. Made her feel bad. In November 1907, someone wrote, "Mr. W. called again this evening for Miss A. He seems to have changed a lot in the past few weeks. He is more animated than I have ever seen him, but there is something in his manner that makes me think he is almost frantic beneath the surface." When I told Miss A about this, she just smiled and said that Mr. W. had finally found a reason to look forward to the future with interest. I couldn't shake the feeling that her smile had a quality I can't quite name. The engagement was announced in the spring of 1908, and the wedding was set for the following September to give everyone time to get ready. During this time, a number of things happened that, looking back, could have been seen as warnings if anyone had been paying attention. In June of 1908, Cornelius's business partner, a man named Silas Drummond, who had worked with the Whitlock family for more than 20 years, suddenly ended the partnership and moved with his family to Boston. He didn't give any reason other than a letter from a tour saying he had accepted a job with a manufacturing company in Massachusetts. Years later, in 1954, Drummond's daughter told a researcher that her father had come home one night very upset and said the family had to leave Brattleboro right away. When asked why, he would only say that he had seen something at the Whitlock house that made him believe Cornelius was under a terrible influence, and that staying in the town would put the whole Drummond family at risk. At the same time, 3 women in their 20s who worked at the Estee factory with Miriam became ill with symptoms that the company doctor called nervous exhaustion. According to factory supervisors, all 3 women had become friends with Miriam during her first year of work. They all reported similar problems, such as headaches that wouldn't go away, sleep that was disturbed by vivid and disturbing dreams, and a feeling of being watched even when they were alone. One of the women, a textile worker named Phyllis Kendrick, provided a statement to authorities after the wedding incident, in which she claimed Miriam had shared tea with her several times during work breaks, and that the symptoms had begun shortly after these social occasions. The SD company's employment records show that all 3 women left their positions before the end of summer 1988. 2 moved away from Brattleboro entirely. The third, Phyllis Kendrick, remained in town but lived as a near recluse until her death in 1932. After the wedding incident, a worker named Phyllis Kendrick gave a statement to the police in which she said that Miriam had shared tea with her several times during work breaks, and that the symptoms had started shortly after these social events. The Estee Company's employment records show that all 3 women left their jobs before the end of summer 1988. 2 of them moved away from Brattleboro completely. The third, Phyllis Kendrick, stayed in town but lived as a near recluse until her death in 1932. Anise kept a small journal of Cornelius's personal effects, in which she wrote repeatedly, sometimes filling entire pages. Never accept hospitality from those whose eyes reflect no light. As the wedding date got closer, Cornelius's behavior became more erratic, at least according to people who dealt with him in business. A farmer from New Fane, who met with him in late August 1908, later told investigators that Cornelius seemed barely present during their meeting. Agreeing to terms that were very bad for him and not wanting to haggle, as was usual when the farmer said he was surprised by the generous offer, Cornelius just waved his hand and said he had more important things to worry about than the small details. His housekeeper, an older woman named Mrs. Hazel Mercer, who had worked for the Whitlock family since before Cornelius was born, gave notice in early September, less than 3 weeks, before the wedding was supposed to happen. Mrs. Mercer wrote to her sister in Springfield, Massachusetts, in a letter that was found among family papers in 1963. She said, "I can't stay in that house any longer, Sarah." Things have changed there since that woman started coming by often. The air feels different, like it's heavier, and I hold my breath when I walk through some rooms. I have found dried plants in Mr. W.'s bedroom twice now, tucked away in corners where I know I will find them when I look for them. Cleaning. When I took them out and asked Mr. W. what they were for, he got angry in a way I had never seen him do before, telling me not to touch anything Miss A. had put in the house. He said she was getting the place ready for their life together, and that I didn't get how important some traditions were. What customs, Sarah? We are not gypsies. We are from New England. I really do worry about him, but I'm too old and scared to stay and watch what's happening there. Mrs. Mercer. They left Brattleboro 3 days after sending that letter and never came back. She turned down all of the investigators' later requests to talk about her time in the Whitlock home. She only told a county official that she had said everything she wanted to say and that some knowledge was not worth having. The plans for the wedding went as planned. Miriam didn't know many people in Brattleboro, so most of the guests were Cornelius's business partners, church members, and a few distant relatives. Family members who came from other parts of Vermont and New Hampshire for the event. Miriam didn't invite anyone. When asked about family or friends who might come, she said that she had lost everyone important to her, and that she wanted to think of this wedding as the start of a new chapter in her life, free from the past. Everyone agrees that the ceremony itself was nothing special. Reverend Josiah Turnbull, who led the ceremony, wrote in his personal diary that both the bride and groom spoke their vows clearly, and that nothing seemed to miss during the service. He did say, though, that during some parts of the ceremony, Miriam's gaze seemed to be fixed on something beyond the altar, as if she were seeing or expecting something that the rest of the congregation couldn't see. This observation didn't mean much at the time, but it did later after the events that followed. The church's fellowship hall, a big room next to the main sanctuary where the congregation held social events, was where the reception took place. There were long tables set up along the walls full of food made by a number of church women. Traditionally, there were platters of cold chicken, potato salad, pickled vegetables, fresh bread, and preserves. The wedding cake, which was a 3-tiered dessert with sugar flowers and delicate piping, was in the middle of the main table. Next to it was a big silver tea set that had been borrowed from one of Brattleboro's more well-known families for the event. Several witnesses later said that Miriam made and served the tea herself. This wasn't out of the ordinary. As a sign of hospitality and thanks, brides often helped serve drinks to their guests. Miriam's insistence on serving some guests herself while directing others to the food platters or punch bowl at the other end of the hall was only interesting to a few guests after the fact. A cousin of Cornelius's, who had come from Keene, New Hampshire for the wedding, told the police that when he reached for A, Miriam had gently pushed him toward the punch instead of the tea, saying that the tea was specially blended and might not be to everyone's taste. 7 people died that night, and most of the people who got very sick had all taken tea from Miriam. The pattern wasn't clear right away because the symptoms got worse at different rates depending on a number of things that toxicologists would later try to piece together. Some guests felt the first effects within an hour. Some people seemed to be fine until they got home, when they got sick and violent as the night went on. The symptoms stayed the same: severe abdominal pain, uncontrollable vomiting, difficulty breathing, and a progressive weakening of the limbs that, in the most severe cases, resulted in total paralysis. Several victims said that their mouths tasted bad for a long time after they drank the tea. Walter Gisham, a church deacon, was one of the men who survived the poisoning. But he never fully got better, but he said it felt like something cold and alive had entered his body and was spreading through his veins like ice water. At about 6 o'clock that evening, the first person died. While she was making dinner for her family, Mrs. Adelaide Frost, a well-known member of the community and the wife of a local banker, fell down in her home. Her husband called Dr. Raymond Cartwright, one of 3 doctors who worked in Brattleboro at the time. When Dr. Cartwright got there, Mrs. F. Frost was very cold, her breathing was hard, and her pulse was uneven. He couldn't give her any treatment before she died. In the next 3 hours, 6 more people in their homes around town died from similar symptoms. It wasn't clear right away how the victims were connected to the wedding because they had all left after the reception. It wasn't until Dr. Cartwright started talking to his coworkers about what he had seen that night that a pattern started to show up. All of the victims had been to the Whitlock wedding. Marriage. All of the victims had drunk the tea that was served at the reception, and the bride gave each victim their cup directly. By the time this thought became clear, around midnight, Miriam Ashworth was gone. Cornelius Whitlock was found in his home on Western Avenue in a state of complete collapse. He was barely conscious and couldn't give a clear account of what had happened. He had not been poisoned. Later, toxicology tests showed that there were no alkaloids in his body. His. It looked like the person's condition was caused by a very strong psychological shock. For almost 2 weeks he stayed like this, with rotating nurses taking care of him at home because the local hospital didn't have enough room for all the victims who needed care. When Cornelius finally got his wits back, his memory of what happened was patchy and not very reliable. He said he remembered the ceremony and the start of the reception, but everything after about 4 o'clock that afternoon was just a blur for him. Impressions that don't connect. The taste of cake, the sound of someone singing, even though no one else remembered music, and the feeling of the room getting colder even though it was warm outside in September. He couldn't remember how he got to his house when Miriam left, or what had happened. The statements he made to investigators that are still in the case file show that he is having a hard time making sense of what has happened to him recently. In an interview that took place 6 days later, he said that Miriam must have been forced or threatened by someone he didn't know after the poisoning. In a second interview 2 days later, he said that she had been replaced by an imposter, and that the woman who served him tea could not have been the same person he had been courting for more than a year. By the 3rd week, he had stopped talking about the wedding or his missing bride. At first, the investigation was mostly about finding Miriam. Descriptions were sent to police departments all over New England. Police departments in New York, Boston, and other big cities got telegrams. Mrs. Pritchard, the boarding housekeeper, said that Miriam's few belongings were still in her room. These included clothes, a small jewelry box with cheap jewelry, and a trunk that, when opened, only had neatly folded linens and a leather-bound book written in a language that no one in Brattleboro could understand. The book became a topic of great interest. Several people who knew foreign languages looked at it, including a classics professor from Dartmouth College and a minister who had been a missionary in the Ottoman Empire. No one could tell what the script or language was. Some people said that the characters looked like ancient Greek or Coptic, but they didn't follow any grammatical or structural rules that were similar to any other language. Reverend Turnbull, upon being shown the book, said that it made him sick and that he wouldn't touch it. He only said that whatever knowledge it had was not meant for Christians. The book was last seen in early 1910, and no one knows where it is now, if it still exists. The investigation also looked into what the poison was made of. Dr. Cartwright did basic toxicological tests on samples of the cake and tea that were taken from the reception hall. In 1910, a medical journal published his findings, which showed the existence of a powerful alkaloid compound in the tea, although he could not ascertain its exact source. The compound had some similarities to well-known plant-based poisons like monkshood and hellor, but it didn't match any of the toxins listed in modern medical literature exactly. Most interestingly, the amount of poison in each cup was very different, which suggests that some guests were purposely given bigger doses than others. The question of why was just as hard to answer as the question of who poisoned the person. There didn't seem to be any real connections between Miriam Ashworth and any of the victims, other than being social acquaintances. She would not have made any money from the deaths. Cornelius's estate would not have gone to her unless they had been married for at least a year. And in any case, his money situation was fine, but not very good. There was no proof that Miriam and any of the dead people had anything against each other. A number of victims had, not having talked to her much before the wedding day. County Prosecutor Leonard Hawthorne put forward a theory that the poisoning wasn't about the victims themselves, but was instead some kind of ritual or demonstration. This theory was never officially proven. Hawthorne wrote to the Vermont State Attorney General, "The careful selection of victims, the varying doses administered, and the dramatic timing all suggest a degree of planning and purpose that goes beyond normal. Criminal motivation. This wasn't a crime of passion or greed. I think that whatever Miss Ashworth's goal was, the deaths may have been just a small part of a bigger plan that we can't even begin to understand." This theory didn't get much attention at the time, but researchers looking into the case brought it up again decades later. In 1952, anthropologist Dr. Margaret Osworth wrote an article for a small academic journal that said some parts of the case were similar to ceremonies that are part of old mystery traditions, especially those that involve symbolic deaths and changes. She pointed out that the bride wanted to personally serve certain guests, that the event was taking place during the autumn equinox, which was a time when many ancient cultures held important rituals, and that the mysterious book that was found in Miriam's trunk had some strange language. At the time, the article didn't get much attention, and Dr. Osworth didn't follow up on it, but it is one of the few times that the case has been looked at from an anthropological point of view instead of just a criminal one. As the weeks went by and there was still no sign of Miriam Ashworth, interest in the case slowly faded. The 7 victims were buried together in one ceremony at the Prospect Hill Cemetery. Their graves had simple headstones that didn't say anything about how they died. The victims who lived on got better slowly, and most of them still had problems from the poisoning. 3 never got back. Complete use of their arms and legs. Several people reported having neurological symptoms that didn't go away, like tremors and episodes of partial paralysis that doctors couldn't fully explain. In the spring of 1910, Cornelius Whitlock sold his house and business and moved west, supposedly to Colorado, where he lived under a fake name until he died in 1934. He never got married and didn't talk to anyone from his life in Brattleboro. A short obituary in a Denver newspaper didn't say anything about where he was from in Vermont, or what happened in 1909. A family from Massachusetts bought the house on Western Avenue in 1913. It had been empty for a few years before that. They lived there for less than 6 months, then sold it for a big loss and left town. Later, owners said nothing strange happened, but the house's bad reputation made it hard to sell or rent. In the end, it was torn down in 1948 to make room for a small business development. The First Congregational Church kept going. Run its fellowship hall, But the silver tea set that was used at the wedding reception was quietly put away and later sold to a church in another state. Reverend Turnbull was the pastor of his church until he retired in 1922. He never married anyone else during that time, saying that the stress of weddings would be too much for his health. In the years after the poisoning, there were reports of several supposed sightings of Miriam Ashworth in different places, a woman who looked like her. People said they saw someone who looked like this in Portland, Maine, in 1911. In 1914, another report said she was in Montreal. In 1918, a hotel clerk in New York City said that he had checked in a woman who looked a lot like the pictures that were sent around after the wedding incident, but she gave him identification papers with a different name. There was never any proof of any of these sightings, and none of them gave any useful information about where she was or what happened to her. The report that caught my attention the most came in 1923, 14 years after the poisoning. A past. Gordon Fairchild, who lived in Brattleboro and moved to San Francisco after World War I, wrote a letter to the Vermont State Police saying he had seen Miriam Ashworth on a streetcar in that city. He said that even though a lot of time had passed, he was sure of the identification. What stood out most about his letter was his claim that Miriam looked the same, as if she hadn't aged since 1909. When investigators looked again, they couldn't find anyone who fit her description. Fairchild didn't want to talk about it anymore, saying only that he wished he had never written the letter and wanted to forget the whole thing. The case stayed open until 1951, when it was finally declared inactive because it was thought that everyone involved had died. The file was sent to the state archives, where it sat in relative obscurity until 1967, when a graduate student studying criminal cases in New England history found it and wrote a short piece for a journal about the history of the area. This article didn't get a lot of attention, but it did lead to a few older people in Brattleboro sharing their memories of the event with local historians. Mabel Thornton was one of these people. She was 11 years old in 1909 and lived on Western Avenue near the Whitlock House. In an interview from 1968, she said that she had seen Miriam Ashworth several times in the year before the wedding. What stood out to young Mabel the most? It wasn't Miriam's looks or behavior that bothered him. It was how animals reacted to her. Dogs would go across the street to stay away from her. Cats would watch her from windows but wouldn't go outside when she walked by. When she got close, the birds would stop singing and only start again when she left. Mrs. Thornton also remembered the day after the poisoning when she and her mother walked by the Whitlock house on their way to town. The front door was open and swinging softly in the morning wind. She said that the sound that came from inside sounded like wind chimes, but there were none in the house. Her mother had quickly pulled her past the house and told her never to go near it again. Mrs. Thornton took a long time to answer when asked for more information about the sound. In the end, she said it sounded less like chimes and more like someone whispering a long list of names too quickly and softly for her to tell what each word was. Another, Jonas Pritchard, the son of the boarding house keeper who had housed Miriam Ashworth, gave a statement in 1969. He remembered how worried his mother was when Miriam lived with them, but he was too young to understand why she was worried at the time. The smell that came from Miriam's room stayed with him the most. He said it smelled like dried autumn leaves mixed with something bitter and medicinal. His mother had said something about it a few times, especially on mornings after Miriam had been out late. When asked where Miriam went on these nighttime trips, Jonas Pritchard said that his mother had never found a good answer. Miriam would just say she was going for a walk and come back hours later, often well after midnight, with no signs of being tired, even though it was late, and she must have walked a long way. The last document in the investigation file is: researchers have been puzzled since the case was reopened for historical research. It is a single page written in a careful hand on paper that looks like it came from a different time than the rest of the file. There is no date or signature on the page. It has what looks like a recipe or formula written in English, but the words used seem to be on purpose. The names of the ingredients are more poetic or metaphorical than botanical or chemical. The measurements are given in units that don't match any regular system. There is one line at the bottom of the page in a different color ink, as if it was added later. She knew what she was doing from the start. It is not clear if this document was part of the original investigation or if it was added to the file later. The Vermont Historical Society's archivists have not been able to figure out where it came from or prove that it is connected to the case. It is an odd thing in a collection of already odd things. The physical. Most of the evidence from the case is no longer available. Dr. Cartwright's samples of tea and cake were thrown away after he died in 1928. As mentioned before, the strange book from Miriam's trunk is gone. No one has been able to find any pictures of the crime scene or the wedding reception in any archive or collection. There are still written records, witness statements, medical reports, official letters, and bits and pieces of personal accounts of people who remembered what happened or what happened after. These papers don't show a typical crime. Instead, they show something that didn't fit into any category. At the time, it was clear that the victims were chosen based on a pattern that no one could see. It was never clear what kind of poison was used. The person who did it disappeared so completely that people started to wonder if she had ever been a real person or if it was all just a shared delusion. And 7 people died and 12 more were hurt. Hurt for good. No matter what the reason was, the effects on the material were clear. In more recent years, people have talked about the case in connection with unsolved historical crimes or strange New England mysteries. Each time the story is told, it tends to focus on different parts. The strange book, the supposed sightings in many cities, the strange things animals do around Miriam Ashworth, or the many ideas about why she did what she did. What stays the same is the basic, not being able to finish the story. Every effort to formulate a coherent explanation faces deficiencies in the evidence or inconsistencies in the testimony that defy resolution. What happened before the wedding reception in September 1909 is what makes the case so scary. Miriam Ashworth lived in Brattleboro for a year and a half, worked at the Estee factory, dated Cornelius Whitlock, and got engaged. At that time, she was a normal member of the community, not very interesting except for her voice and her shyness. She went to church. She kept working hard. She got along well with the people around her, even if they weren't very close. And then, on a sunny fall afternoon, she carefully and precisely made poison for the wedding guests. 7 people died, and many more were changed forever. What goes through a person's mind while they are getting ready for something like this? What reason or belief keeps this plan going? There is still no answer to these questions because Miriam Ashworth did not leave a confession, a manifesto, or any other kind of explanation. She just vanished, taking with her whatever knowledge she had into a place where she never came back. People who lived in Brattleboro and were still alive long enough to be interviewed about the case in the 1950s and 1960s all said the same thing. There was something in town that didn't belong there. Something that looked like a person and played a human role, but followed rules and goals that no one else could understand. It's hard to say for sure if Miriam Ashworth was really such an odd case or just a troubled person whose crimes grew into legends over time. It is certain that 7 people drank a poisoned drink at a wedding reception in the First Congregational Church's Fellowship Hall in Brattleboro, Vermont, on September 18, 1909. Bride who then disappeared without a trace. The investigation that came after couldn't find the bride, figure out why she was missing, or bring anyone to justice. The case was finally put away and marked as inactive. And in old records, memories, and the occasional historical footnote, The story lives on, as incomplete and troubling now as it did more than 100 years ago. The last piece of paper in the case file is a note from Prosecutor Leonard Hawthorne from December 1909, 3 months after the poisoning. This office admits that our investigation has serious flaws. We haven't been able to catch the main suspect, figure out the motive, or give the families of the dead satisfactory answers. What we've learned may be more disturbing than what we've failed to find. We found evidence of planning and intent that suggests capabilities beyond what we thought were possible. It's still unclear whether Miss Ashworth acted alone or as part of a larger group. What is clear is that she came to Brattleboro with a purpose, executed that purpose with chilling effectiveness, and departed, leaving only questions behind. I confess that I sleep less soundly now than before this case began, knowing that such things are possible in our modern world. That admission, written by a man accustomed to dealing with crime and human failing, perhaps comes closest to capturing the essence of what the Poison Bride case represents: a rupture in the expected order of things, a demonstration that the limits of understanding are not as solid as we would like to think. The 7 people buried at Prospect Hill Cemetery are a permanent reminder of this unsettling truth. Their deaths were not random accidents or bad luck. They were planned by someone who lived in the community, smiled, talked to people, and went about their daily life while hiding their true intentions until it was too late. In 1969, the last formal research into the case ended with a short academic paper. The author noted that there wasn't enough evidence to make strong claims about Miriam Ashworth's identity, background, or final fate. They suggested that the case might show how some crimes go beyond the investigative skills of their time, leaving only bits and pieces and speculation. The paper was put away in a university library archive and didn't get any more academic attention. And so the story ends where it began, with uncertainty and unanswered questions, somewhere in the records of September. There is a truth about Miriam Ashworth and her actions that lies in 1909. But that truth has proven to be as hard to find as the woman herself. The wedding guests who drank poisoned tea are long dead, and the bride who served it has disappeared into history. The town where it happened has changed so much that it is unrecognizable. What remains is the account itself, which is preserved in fading documents and fading memories. It is a reminder that some events resist all attempts at complete understanding. The Poison Bride of Vermont walked into Brattleboro in the spring of 1907 and walked out again. In September 1909, leaving behind 7 dead bodies and an unsolved mystery. No one knows where she came from or where she went. What she was is a question that may never be fully answered.